Before the great kingdoms rose with their banners and iron crowns, before even the stones of Winterfell were laid into place, Westeros existed in a state of profound and ancient mystery. The world itself was younger then, or perhaps it merely felt that way to those who walked beneath its trees. The forests stretched beyond imagining, great stands of ancient wood that had never known the bite of an axe, or the crackle of civilization's clearing fires. These forests were alive in ways that modern men could scarcely comprehend, not alive as a creature is alive, but alive with something deeper, more fundamental, a consciousness woven into the very roots and soil itself. In those primordial times, when the world still sang with magic, and the very bones of the earth remembered the touch of divine hands, there existed a people unlike any who would come after them. The Children of the Forest they would later be called, a name that carried with it both wonder and loss, as though the speaker mourned even as they spoke. These were small beings by the measure of men, standing barely to a man's chest, with fine, delicate features, and skin that seemed to shift between brown and green, depending on how the light fell through the leaves. Their eyes held an intelligence that was ancient and knowing, the eyes of creatures who had watched the turning of seasons through countless generations, who understood the patterns of growth and decay and renewal that governed the world. The children were bound to the forests in a way that defied simple explanation. To them, the trees were not mere wood and bark, but something far more intimate, a language, a connection, perhaps even a form of kinship. They could read in the growth rings a history that stretched back to the world's first dawning. They could feel the pulse of life through roots that ran deeper than the deepest mine shaft. In the hearts of the greatest trees, the weirwoods with their pale trunks and blood-red leaves, they could sense something transcendent, a thread connecting them to powers that dwelt beyond the reach of normal understanding. The children possessed gifts that modern men would later dismiss as magic, though magic itself is perhaps too simple a word for the deep understanding they held of the world's hidden machinery. They had lived in this state of harmony for long ages, beyond counting. The forests provided everything they needed, sustenance from root and berry and stream, shelter beneath ancient boughs, and most importantly, a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. Their settlements were small, scattered throughout the great woodlands, places where they had learned to build without destroying, to take without depleting. They had no great cities because they needed none. Their kingdoms existed in the quiet places between the trees, in groves sacred and secret, in underground caverns where crystalline waters ran, and luminescent fungi painted the darkness with soft, ghostly light. To them, this was perfection, a world in balance where all things had their place and their purpose. But change, when it came, arrived with terrible swiftness. In what would later be counted as approximately 12,000 years before the wars of men, when the children's long dominion had stretched for epochs beyond measure, something unprecedented occurred. From across the narrow sea, from the lands of Essos, came newcomers. They arrived not as traders or wanderers seeking temporary refuge, but as invaders armed with weapons and hunger. These were the first men, bronze-skinned warriors carrying bronze axes and swords, driving horses that had never been seen in Westeros before. They came in waves, ship after ship landing on the eastern shores, each vessel disgorging hundreds of fierce, determined fighters, ready to make this land their own. The first men were everything the children were not. Large, aggressive, driven by appetites and ambitions that seemed boundless. Where the children had lived lightly upon the land, taking only what they needed, the first men arrived with axes ready, with fire already burning in their eyes. They saw the forests not as sacred places to be honored, but as obstacles to be overcome, as sources of timber and cleared land upon which to build their settlements and fortifications. They understood the concept of ownership in a way the children never had, of land claimed and held and defended, of borders drawn and boundaries asserted. Within years, the great forests began to fall. The sound of axes echoed through ancient groves that had known only the wind's whisper and the songs of birds. Flames rose where once only starlight had illuminated the darkness, as the first men cleared vast swathes of woodland to build their farms and strongholds. The children, watching their world transform around them, could not stand idle. They possessed powers that men could scarcely imagine, gifts born from their deep connection to the earth itself. They called upon the land to rise and strike against these invaders. The very ground seemed to respond to their pleas, bucking and heaving beneath the feet of the first men's armies. Storms of terrible fury were summoned to sweep across the plains, winds that could strip bark from trees and overturn carts laden with supplies. They wielded magic as one might wield a spear or sword, but magic rooted in the ancient earth, not in staffs or incantations, but in the fundamental forces that shaped the world. For a time, it seemed that the very strength of the world itself would rise to defend its oldest children. Yet the first men possessed something that could not be countered by magic alone. They possessed numbers, and more than that, they possessed a kind of relentless determination that nothing seemed to break. When one army fell, another was sent. When settlements were destroyed by sorcery and storm, they were rebuilt. The first men brought their children to these shores, their wives and their herds, making it clear through 1,000 small actions that they were not raiders who would eventually retreat. They were here to stay, and no force on earth would turn them away. For long years the conflict continued, a grinding war of attrition that bled both peoples and scarred the land itself. The forests burned. Great weirwoods, ancient beyond measure, were felled and their crimson leaves scattered to ash on the wind. Thousands upon thousands died on both sides, children of the forest discovering that their magic, however powerful, could not stand against determined men armed with bronze and backed by endless waves of reinforcement. The first men learned costly lessons as well, paying in blood and bodies for each inch of conquered ground, losing warriors to spells and sorcery they could not comprehend or defend against. The very heart was torn from Westeros in those centuries of conflict, a wound that would never fully heal. But eventually, exhaustion set in on both sides. Neither people could continue the struggle indefinitely. The children, despite their magic and their deep connection to the land, were fewer in number with each passing year. The first men, though they possessed superior numbers and breeding stock, had paid a price in blood that could not easily be sustained indefinitely. It was in this state of mutual exhaustion, with both peoples battered and worn, that something remarkable occurred. On an island in a great lake, said to hold great mystical power, representatives of both peoples met to forge what became known as the Pact of the Isle of Faces. It was an agreement born not of one side's triumph over the other, but of a recognition that continued conflict served neither people. The children would retain their forests, particularly the great woodland of the Neck and the forests beyond, places where they could maintain their ancient ways and their sacred groves. The first men would have the cleared lands and the open plains, where they could build their settlements and establish their kingdoms. More than that, and this proved to be the most enduring aspect of the pact, the first men agreed to cease their assault on the sacred weirwood trees. They would learn to respect the deep places of the children, the groves where the ancient magic dwelt most strongly. In return, the children would not raise their full powers against the first men, would allow this new people to make their home in the lands given to them. It was a compromise that neither side had expected to reach, yet it proved to be one of the most significant agreements in the history of Westeros, an accord that would shape everything that came after, enduring long after both peoples had passed into legend and myth. In the time that followed the Great Pact, something remarkable and unforeseen began to unfold across the lands of Westeros. The collision between two peoples that might have been expected to produce only lasting enmity and bitter memory instead gave rise to something far more complex and ultimately more enduring. The first men, for all their fierce pride and their hunger for conquest, possessed a quality that allowed them to adapt, to learn from those they encountered, to absorb into their own culture the things of value that they found. And the children of the forest, despite the terrible cost of their conflict with these invaders, held knowledge and wisdom that even the stubborn descendants of Essos could recognize as worthy of preservation. The transformation did not occur swiftly, nor did it come peacefully. It was a process that unfolded gradually, one generation yielding its rigid certainties to the next, beliefs shifting like sand carried by the wind, ideas taking root in foreign soil, and somehow blooming into something neither their origin nor their new home would have predicted. In the great forests of the north, where the first men had established their kingdoms and strongholds, they began to encounter something that their Bronze Age minds had not prepared them to understand. The weirwoods, those great pale trees with their blood-red leaves, began to speak to certain individuals among the first men in ways that defied rational explanation. These were men and women who possessed a gift, a connection to the older magics that the children had wielded for countless ages. Such individuals came to be known as green seers and skin changers, those who could perceive through the eyes of animals or glimpse visions through the twisted faces carved into the ancient trees. At first, these abilities were treated with fear and suspicion as harbingers of witchcraft and dark sorcery that might bring down the wrath of the gods. But as time passed, and as these gifted individuals proved themselves not as threats, but as sources of profound wisdom and strange power, attitudes began to shift. What was once deemed dangerous came to be recognized as holy. The first men of the north began to spend time in the sacred groves, kneeling before the weirwoods with their blood-red leaves, and their faces carved in eternal sorrow and witness. They felt upon their skin the chill of the older world, the power that dwelt in things ancient and primal. They came to understand that the children's old gods were not demons or false idols, but true expressions of something that dwelt within the very fabric of existence itself. These gods were not distant or unreachable, demanding elaborate temples and priestly intermediaries. Instead, they were woven into the land itself, present in every tree and stream, in the earth beneath one's feet and the wind upon one's face. The worship of the old gods transformed the northern kingdoms in profound ways. Where once the first men might have offered elaborate sacrifices to distant and demanding deities, they instead found themselves in quiet communion with something far more intimate and immediate. A man standing before a weirwood at dawn could speak his fears and his hopes to the tree, and in the silence that followed, in the patterns of wind through leaves and the play of light on bark, he might find clarity he had not possessed before. A woman seeking guidance might lay her hands upon the pale trunk and feel through her fingertips the memories that the ancient trees held, impressions of all that had transpired before her, all the lives that had come and gone beneath these boughs. This adoption of the old gods by the first men created something unprecedented in their history. Where they had once been a people of bronze and iron, hard and practical, and focused upon conquest and dominion, they began to develop a spiritual dimension that had been lacking. The great northern houses, particularly House Stark, came to embody this fusion between the old warrior spirit of the invaders and the mystical connection to the land held by the children. The Starks did not abandon their fierceness or their martial prowess, but they tempered these qualities with a reverence for duty and honor that seemed to spring from something deeper than mere military code. The words that would eventually define the North, spoken by its rulers in times of war and peace alike, emerged from this blending. "Winter is coming," they would declare, a phrase that acknowledged both the cycles of the world they inhabited and a kind of solemn acceptance of hardship and survival. These were not merely words of warning, but expressions of a philosophy that had been forged in the crucible of their encounter with the children and the older magic they represented. The Starks learned to rule with a sense of responsibility that extended beyond their immediate subjects to encompass the very land itself, the forests and streams, the creatures wild and free. This transformation did not spread uniformly across all of Westeros. The southern kingdoms, particularly after the later arrival of the Andals with their own foreign gods, moved in a different direction entirely. The Andals brought with them the faith of the Seven, a religion that emphasized order and hierarchy, the division of divine aspects among multiple godlike entities, rather than the mystical connection to land and nature that the first men of the North had adopted. The southern kingdoms embraced this faith with enthusiasm, building grand cathedrals of stone and glass, where priests in elaborate vestments performed rituals and interceded between the faithful and the divine. But in the north, the ancient weirwoods remained, and with them remained the connection to something far older than any organized religion. The North would never fully abandon its old gods, even as the centuries passed, and the memory of the children of the forest faded into legend and myth. The weirwoods stood as living reminders of a time before kingdoms, before conquest, before the complications of human ambition and power struggled for dominance. They stood as witnesses to the ages, their carved faces watching generation after generation of northern rulers come and go, their red leaves marking the turning of seasons through countless cycles. The blending of the two peoples created a cultural identity that would endure for thousands of years. The first men and the children did not merge into a single race, but their intertwining left marks that ran deep. Northern bloodlines carried the legacy of both peoples. Some possessed features more associated with the delicate frame and pale skin of the children, while others bore the stronger build and darker coloring of the first men, and many carried a mixture of both. But more than physical inheritance, it was the spiritual legacy that defined them. The North became a place apart from the rest of Westeros, not in a spirit of rejection or hostility toward their southern neighbors, but simply in recognition that they walked a different path. In times of great darkness and hardship, when the very existence of the realm was threatened, it would be this blending of cultures that would give the North its strength and resilience. The combination of the first men's warrior pride and practical determination, with the children's connection to the deeper magics of the world, created something formidable, something that could endure when lesser peoples might have fallen. The great houses of the North, most notably House Stark, would carry this legacy forward through the ages. They would rule not merely as lords claiming dominion through force of arms, but as stewards of the land itself, keepers of an older truth that had been preserved through the blending of two different ways of understanding the world. In their halls and strongholds, ancient weirwoods would be protected and revered. In their hearts, the duty and honor instilled by the children's teachings would burn alongside the fierce pride and determination inherited from their first men ancestors. This duality would define the North and give it a character that would remain recognizable and distinct even after many thousands of years had passed since the Great Pact was first sealed. There exist in the oldest of stories the tales whispered by fireside in the darkest hours of winter, accounts of a time so terrible and so complete in its devastation that the memory of it reshaped the very character of men and the lands they inhabited. This was the age that would come to be known as the Long Night, and while the exact span of years that encompassed this catastrophe remains shrouded in uncertainty and confusion, the consequences of those terrible years reverberated through all the ages that followed. The phrase itself, the Long Night, carries within it a weight of dread and finality that no ordinary winter could possess, for what was endured during those ages was not merely cold or darkness, but something far more profound and terrible. In the depths of the age that followed the pact, when the first men and the children of the forest had begun to settle into their new arrangement, there came a shift in the world that could not be ignored or explained away. The seasons began to behave in ways that violated every pattern and every expectation that had been built over countless generations. Winter came, as it always had, but this time it did not depart as it should have. The snow fell and continued to fall, season after season, until the very stones of the earth seemed buried beneath an ever-deepening blanket of white. The temperatures plummeted far below anything recorded in living memory, descending to levels that seemed incompatible with human survival itself. The sun itself seemed to weaken, becoming a pale and distant thing in the sky, providing neither warmth nor reliable light. Days became dim and twilight affairs, where even at midday the world was wrapped in a kind of perpetual dusk. The crops that men had learned to cultivate failed entirely, frozen in the ground before they could reach maturity. The herds of animals that provided sustenance, already stressed by the relentless cold, began to die off in vast numbers. Birds fell from the sky, their bodies frozen solid as they flew. The very stones of buildings began to crack under the assault of such unrelenting cold. Within months of the onset of this terrible winter, starvation became the dominant reality for every settlement, every stronghold, every outpost of civilization that had been carved out of the wilderness. But the cold and the hunger, terrible as they were, would prove to be merely the prelude to something infinitely worse. For as the eternal winter deepened, and the light continued to fade, there came a presence from the far north, from beyond the great wall of ice and snow that marked the edge of the known world. These entities, known only as the White Walkers, or sometimes by the older term, the Others, emerged from the realm of ice and darkness, like the harbingers of the very end of existence itself. They were tall and terrible to behold, figures of preternatural elegance and malevolence, their skin pale as fresh snow, their eyes burning with a blue light that spoke of cold so intense it could freeze the very essence of life itself. These creatures appeared to be wielders of a magic so profound and so utterly antithetical to life that mere proximity to them caused death and decay to accelerate unnaturally. Where they walked, the earth itself seemed to blacken and sicken. Plants withered instantly at their touch, as though all vitality was being drained from the world. Animals fled before them, driven mad by terror. Men exposed to their presence often found themselves unable to move, paralyzed by an ancient fear that seemed to bypass reason and lodge itself directly in the soul. They bore weapons of crystalline ice that never melted and never dulled, blades that sang with a terrible music when they cut through air and flesh alike. The response of humanity and the children of the forest was initially chaotic and ineffective. Conventional weapons and tactics that had served well in wars against other men proved nearly useless against these entities. A sword that could pierce armor and bone seemed to pass through the White Walkers without drawing anything resembling blood or damage. Arrows simply bounced away or were caught mid-flight with casual ease. For a time, it seemed as though these creatures were truly unstoppable, harbingers of an ending that could not be prevented or forestalled by any means within mortal reach. The White Walkers seemed intent on spreading their reign of cold and darkness across all of Westeros, to extinguish life itself and replace the warm world of sun and green growth with an eternal void of ice and frozen death. In desperation, the children of the forest revealed knowledge that had been kept in reserve, a secret preserved from ages past. In their own realms, they had discovered a stone of extraordinary properties, a material born from volcanic fires of immense intensity. This stone, which they called dragon glass, or in the high Valyrian tongue, from which much of ancient knowledge derived, dragon steel in some tellings, possessed properties that seemed to work upon the White Walkers in ways that normal materials could not. When a blade of dragon glass was driven into one of these creatures, it shattered like glass, its ethereal form unable to maintain cohesion. The magic that animated it, whatever dark sorcery had given it existence, seemed to be incompatible with the particular nature of this ancient volcanic stone. Armed with this knowledge, both men and the children began to forge weapons of dragon glass, fashioning blades and spear points with whatever skill and haste they could muster. Across the lands of Westeros, great gatherings of both peoples came together in common cause, united as they had never been united since the signing of the pact. Ancient grievances were temporarily set aside in the face of a threat that transcended all lesser concerns. The first men brought their numbers and their martial prowess, their determination, and their ability to organize warriors for sustained campaigns. The children brought their deep magic and their intimate knowledge of the land itself, their ability to perceive and predict the movements of their enemies in ways that seemed almost supernatural. One figure in particular emerged from this desperate struggle, a figure so legendary that the exact details of his life became almost impossible to disentangle from the mythology that grew up around him. His name was Azor Ahai, and he became known as the Prince that was promised, though the exact meaning of that title and its prophecy has been debated and discussed through all the ages that followed. Azor Ahai wielded a weapon of such power and such singular nature that it became the very symbol of the struggle against darkness. This sword, forged through means that remain unclear even in the fragmentary accounts that have survived, was called Lightbringer, and it burned with a magical flame that could not be extinguished by any means. The blade itself seemed to embody a light that was antithetical to the darkness represented by the White Walkers. When Azor Ahai wielded it, the sword burned with such brilliance that it seemed to drive back the shadows themselves. In the accounts of his deeds, there appears a darkly mysterious passage that has spawned endless interpretations and theories. According to the oldest legends, Azor Ahai was driven by love and desperation as the darkness continued to spread and the battle seemed lost. In a moment of profound sacrifice and inexplicable magic, he drove the blade through the heart of his own beloved, a woman named Nissa. Some accounts suggest this was done with her knowledge and consent, a willing sacrifice made to unlock the weapon's full power. Others hint at darker possibilities, though the exact nature of what occurred remains one of the great mysteries of history. What is certain is that following this act, Lightbringer became something more than it had been. The blade burned with a light that was not natural fire, but something deeper and more fundamental, a magical radiance that could pierce the defenses of the White Walkers as nothing else could. In the hands of Azor Ahai and the champions who fought alongside him, Lightbringer became the symbol of hope itself, a beacon around which the forces of light could gather. The tide of the long night gradually began to turn, though the struggle was long and the cost in lives immeasurable. The White Walkers, pushed back across the frozen wastes, were eventually driven far enough north that they ceased to pose an immediate threat to the lands where men could live and cultivate their settlements. With the passing of the immediate crisis, though not necessarily the threat, a period of reconstruction and consolidation began. The psychological impact of the long night was profound and lasting, reshaping the very world-view of Westeros' inhabitants. The phrase, "winter is coming," became more than a simple observation about the seasons. It became a solemn reminder of how fragile civilization truly was, how quickly the forces of darkness and cold could threaten to overwhelm everything that had been built. The people of the North particularly internalized this understanding, embedding it into their very identity, and the teachings they would pass down through generations unborn. The memory of the Long Night also secured the alliance between the first men and the children of the forest, at least for a time. Both peoples had bled together against the common darkness, and that shared sacrifice created bonds that transcended the earlier conflicts. It was in this moment, with the threat of the White Walkers still present, though temporarily contained, that the decision was made to construct something unprecedented, something that would stand as a permanent reminder of the price of complacency and a monument to eternal vigilance against the darkness. In the aftermath of the Long Night, when the White Walkers had been driven back into the frozen realm beyond the reach of men, and when the survivors began to comprehend both the magnitude of what they had endured and the fragility of their position should such darkness return, a decision was made that would echo through all the ages yet to come. This decision would shape the course of history in ways both obvious and subtle, would give rise to an institution that would outlast kingdoms and outlive the very peoples who had created it, and would serve as a physical manifestation of humanity's determination to hold back the encroaching darkness at any cost. The architect of this unprecedented undertaking was a man whose name has become so intertwined with legend that the exact historical record of his life has become nearly impossible to separate from the mythology that has grown around it like vines upon ancient stone. His name was Bran the Builder, and he is credited not only with the construction of the wall, but also with the founding of House Stark itself and the building of their ancestral seat at Winterfell. Some accounts suggest that Bran the Builder possessed powers that seemed to approach magic itself, that he could command giants to labor at his behest, that he possessed gifts of foresight or connection to older powers that allowed him to perceive what needed to be done. Whether these accounts possess any foundation in literal truth, or whether they are instead the elaborations of storytellers seeking to explain the impossible scale of his achievements, remains a matter of endless debate among scholars. What is certain is that the wall itself represents one of the most extraordinary feats of construction that has ever been attempted by human hands. A structure so vast and so ambitious that it seems almost incomprehensible that it could have been built at all, much less that it could have been constructed in the relatively short time frame suggested by the historical records. The wall rises from the earth in a great arc that stretches for hundreds of miles, a barrier of ice and stone that stands at heights exceeding 700 feet, making it taller than any castle or fortress that would ever be built in all of Westeros. To stand at its base and gaze upward toward its top is to experience a visceral sense of both awe and helplessness, a realization of the sheer scale of the undertaking that brought it into being. The construction itself presented challenges that defied conventional explanation. Stone blocks of tremendous size, many of them weighing as much as entire buildings, were somehow quarried and fitted together with such precision that mortar was barely necessary to hold them in place. Yet the wall is not merely stone, though stone comprises much of its structure. Woven throughout the entire edifice are threads of magic so ancient and so fundamental that they have become nearly impossible to distinguish from the physical properties of the structure itself. The magic that runs through the wall carries with it certain properties that make it anathema to the White Walkers and to other creatures of dark sorcery. This magic creates a barrier, not merely physical, but metaphysical. A boundary that separates the realm of living men from the unclaimed wilderness and supernatural threats that dwell beyond it. The exact nature of the magic woven into the wall remains one of the great mysteries of history. Some accounts suggest that the magic was placed there through rituals performed by the children of the forest, their last great act of power in service to humanity before they faded from the world. Other stories speak of sacrifices made during the construction, suggesting that the wall was somehow bound together, not merely through physical labor, but through some darker and more sinister means. The most disturbing of these accounts speak of human beings, possibly children or prisoners, being sealed within the wall itself during its construction, their bodies and souls serving as anchors for the magic that would hold it together and maintain its protective properties through all the ages that would follow. Whatever the truth of its creation, the wall stood completed, a monument to what could be accomplished when necessity drove men to transcend their ordinary limitations. It became immediately apparent, however, that the wall itself, impressive as it was, represented only part of what would be needed to maintain the barrier between the realm of men and whatever threats lurked beyond it. A structure of such immense scale required constant maintenance and vigilance. The stones needed to be inspected for cracks and weaknesses. The magic woven through it needed to be reinforced and protected. Most importantly, there needed to be men stationed along the entire length of the wall who possessed both the courage and the commitment to maintain a constant watch against any signs of threat. It was in response to these needs that the order known as the Night's Watch was established, though the name itself contains a certain historical irony, since those who joined this order did not necessarily come from the knightly classes, and did not always behave with knightly virtue. The Night's Watch was founded as a brotherhood of men, sworn to a common purpose and bound together by sacred oaths that superseded all other loyalties and commitments. These men were gathered from across the realm, some volunteering freely out of a sense of duty or belief in the importance of the mission, others conscripted by necessity or by circumstance. Still others came to the wall as a form of escape, seeking to leave behind lives of shame or criminality, finding in the Night's Watch a means of redemption, or at least a way to direct their energies toward something that mattered beyond their own personal concerns. The oath sworn by those joining the Night's Watch was comprehensive and absolute in its demands. A man taking the black, as the ritual came to be known, renounced all previous claims and titles. He surrendered his family name and any lands or holdings to which he might have had claim. He vowed to fight against the enemies of the realm, regardless of what those enemies might be, setting aside personal animosities and political allegiances in favor of the greater good. He pledged to remain on the wall for the duration of his life, to accept the leadership of the Lord Commander without question, and to maintain the watch even in the direst circumstances. Some versions of the oath suggest that the vow extended even beyond death, that a man of the Night's Watch was bound to remain at his post eternally, serving as guardian and watcher beyond the reach of mortal life itself. The Night's Watch established a series of fortifications along the length of the wall, great castles and strongholds from which the watch could be organized and maintained. The most prominent of these was Castle Black, which served as the primary base of operations and the seat of the Lord Commander. Other major strongholds included the Night Fort, an ancient and massive fortress that had been constructed in the earliest days of the Wall, and which carried with it certain mysterious properties and a reputation for being somehow accursed or touched by dark magic. Additional castles and garrison positions were spread along the entire length of the Wall, though many of these eventually fell into disuse and ruin as the centuries passed, and the threat from beyond the Wall seemed to diminish or to shift in nature. The establishment of the Night's Watch created an institution unlike anything else in Westeros. It was neither purely a military order nor a religious organization, though it possessed elements of both. It existed outside the normal structure of noble houses and political power, instead occupying a liminal space where men from all stations of life came together with a common purpose. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch held authority that was in some ways greater than that of any lord in the southern kingdoms, for he commanded the absolute obedience of thousands of men spread across hundreds of miles. Yet his power was also constrained and limited in ways that no other leader experienced, for he could never leave his post, never venture south of the Wall into the lands of the living realm. The initial centuries of the Night's Watch's existence saw it as a vital and honored institution. The best warriors were attracted to its ranks, men seeking to prove themselves against real threats and genuine challenges. The Wall was maintained in excellent condition, the castles were well supplied and well defended, and the watch was kept with meticulous attention to detail. Expeditions beyond the Wall were regularly undertaken, seeking to explore the lands beyond, and to ensure that no threat was building undetected. These ranging parties, as they came to be called, often ventured far into the wilderness, seeking knowledge and maintaining vigilance. However, as the centuries passed and the generations accumulated, the nature of the Night's Watch began to shift and degrade. With no major incursion from beyond the Wall for hundreds of years, and with the White Walkers becoming the stuff of legend rather than immediate memory, the importance of maintaining the watch began to be questioned by those in the southern kingdoms. The resources that had once flowed freely to support the Night's Watch began to dry up as lords, and kings became preoccupied with the petty politics and power struggles that consumed their attention. The Wall, magnificent though it remained, came to be seen increasingly as a relic of a past age rather than a necessity of the present. The Night's Watch, once the destination of the realm's finest warriors and most honorable men, came gradually to be viewed as a dumping ground for criminals, exiles, and misfits. The noble families of the South began to send their sons, who were deemed troublesome or unwanted, to take the black, and the quality of men serving on the Wall began to decline accordingly. Yet despite this gradual erosion of support and respect, the Night's Watch endured. The Wall remained, standing as it always had, a physical barrier against whatever might lurk in the frozen wastes beyond. And in the darkness of its castles and the cold of its watch stations, men continued to gather, season after season, year after year, maintaining a vigil against threats that most people had come to believe would never materialize, holding the line between the world of men and the unknown wilderness that lay beyond, serving as humanity's eternal guardians against a darkness that few any longer believed in. In the age that followed the establishment of the Wall and the Night's Watch, as the northern kingdoms settled into a pattern of watchful waiting, and as memories of the long night began to fade into the misty realm of ancient history, other changes were taking shape across the broader landscape of Westeros that would ultimately prove to be just as significant and far-reaching as any of the great constructions or institutions that had come before. These changes would not manifest themselves through sudden conquest or dramatic catastrophe, but rather through a slow and steady transformation in the spiritual beliefs and religious practices that governed how men understood their place in the world and their relationship to the divine forces that shaped their destinies. For many generations, the religious landscape of Westeros had been relatively simple and uniform in character, at least in terms of the broad geographic divisions that defined the realm. In the north, and in the lands where the first men had maintained their ancestral traditions, the worship of the old gods through the sacred weirwood trees had remained the dominant spiritual practice. These beliefs, formed through the blending of first men culture with the older magical traditions of the children of the forest, created a form of spirituality that was intimate and personal, tied closely to the land itself and to the cycles of nature that governed all existence. Yet in other parts of Westeros, particularly in the southern and eastern reaches, a new religious force was beginning to make itself felt. This new faith came with the arrival of a people known as the Andals, who began to arrive in Westeros in waves of migration and invasion, their exact origins and homeland matters of historical debate and scholarly dispute. The Andals came bearing with them a completely different conception of divinity and religious practice, one that would fundamentally alter the spiritual landscape of the lands they conquered and settled. Where the old gods of the north were woven into the land itself, present in trees and streams and earth, the Andals worshipped what came to be known as the Faith of the Seven, a religion that conceived of divinity in terms of 7 distinct aspects, or faces, each representing different divine qualities and different spheres of influence over human affairs. According to the teachings of the faith, the 7 aspects of divinity included the Father, representing justice and judgment, the stern and righteous lawgiver, who ensured that wrongs were punished and righteousness was rewarded. There was the Mother, embodying nurturing and compassion, the merciful aspect of the divine that healed wounds and forgave trespasses. The Maiden represented innocence and youth, the beauty and potential that lay in youth and new beginnings. The crone symbolized wisdom and age, the accumulated knowledge of long years of existence and experience. The warrior embodied strength and courage, the martial aspect of divinity that enabled men to defend themselves and their loved ones against threats and enemies. The smith represented labor and craftsmanship, the dignity that came from hard work, and the creation of useful and beautiful things through honest effort. Finally, the stranger represented death and the unknown, the inevitable conclusion that awaited all living things, the aspect of the divine that stood outside conventional moral categories, and simply was. This conception of divinity, with its multiple aspects and organized structure, proved to be far more appealing to many of the peoples of Westeros than the more abstract and mystical traditions of the old gods. The faith of the Seven provided a more concrete and comprehensible framework for understanding the divine, one that divided spiritual concerns into clear categories and established priests and priestesses who could intercede between the faithful and the divine. It offered comfort through its structure and its explanations, providing clear moral codes and ethical guidelines for how one should live one's life. Where the old gods required a certain degree of mystical sensitivity or connection to nature to fully understand their teachings, the faith of the Seven was more accessible to ordinary men and women who simply wished to live good lives and secure the favor of the divine through conventional religious practice. The Andals brought more than just religious ideas to Westeros, however. They came as conquerors and settlers, establishing themselves throughout the southern and central parts of the realm through military campaigns and the gradual encroachment of their settlements and influence. They destroyed many of the sacred weirwoods that stood in the lands they conquered, replacing them with temples and cathedrals dedicated to the faith. They suppressed the older religious practices, sometimes through violent means, sometimes through gradual cultural pressure and the allure of the new faith they offered. Over generations, the spiritual landscape of the South transformed completely, the old ways fading until they became mere curiosities or folklore rather than living religious traditions. This fundamental religious divide created what would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of Westeros, a split between the North and the South that went far deeper than mere geography or political allegiance. It was a spiritual and philosophical divide, representing fundamentally different ways of understanding the relationship between humanity and the divine, different approaches to the sacred and the profane. The North clung to its old gods and its ancient traditions, seeing in them a connection to something primal and powerful that had been tested and proven true through countless ages of hardship and struggle. The South embraced the organized structure and moral clarity offered by the faith of the Seven, finding comfort in the accessibility of its teachings and the promise of salvation that it offered. These religious differences manifested themselves in countless small ways throughout daily life and governance. The North's ruling families, particularly House Stark, maintained sacred groves where weirwoods still stood, places where men could seek counsel and communion with the old gods in moments of great importance or deep uncertainty. The ruling councils of northern lords would often meet in these sacred places, and major decisions affecting the realm would be made while standing before the weirwoods, the weight of ancient tradition and spiritual significance lending gravity to even ordinary matters of governance. In the South, by contrast, the great temples and cathedrals of the faith became the centers around which both spiritual and political life revolved. Kings and lords maintained court in cathedrals or near them, and the opinions of the high priests and priestesses of the faith carried enormous weight in matters of state. Religious ceremonies and processions marked the seasons and the major events of life, and adherence to the moral code promulgated by the faith became a measure of a person's standing in society and their fitness to rule or to hold positions of authority. Beyond the realms directly controlled by the northern kingdoms or the southern followers of the faith lay the lands inhabited by the free folk, commonly known as the wildlings, by those living south of the wall. These were peoples who had chosen to maintain their independence and their freedom at all costs, refusing to bend the knee to any king or lord, and organizing themselves into loose tribal confederations held together more by bonds of kinship and mutual interest than by any formal structure of governance or allegiance. The free folk maintained their own spiritual traditions, which varied considerably from group to group, but which generally emphasized individual connection to the natural world and practical spirituality focused on survival and success in the harsh environment in which they lived. The relationship between the free folk and the settled kingdoms to the south was complicated and fraught with tension. For millennia, the free folk had occasionally raided and invaded the northern lands, seeking resources and plunder from the more settled and organized societies to their south. These incursions were generally repelled by the northern forces, and the border between the wall and the lands of the free folk remained one of constant tension and occasional outright conflict. Yet there was also a degree of mutual respect between the free folk and the North, born from a recognition that both peoples valued freedom and independence in ways that the more structured and hierarchical societies of the South often did not. This religious and cultural divide created a situation of remarkable complexity and ongoing tension throughout Westeros. The northern kingdoms, maintaining their ancient traditions and their connection to the old gods, became increasingly isolated from the spiritual trends reshaping the rest of the continent. Yet this isolation also served to preserve something precious and primal, a connection to an older and more authentic magic that had been sacrificed by the southern kingdoms in exchange for order and structure. The southern kingdoms, embracing the faith of the Seven and all that came with it, gained organizational coherence and clarity of purpose, but lost something in the process, a connection to the deeper and more mysterious aspects of existence that the old gods represented. Over centuries and then over millennia, these religious differences became embedded in the identity of the different regions and peoples of Westeros. The North and the South grew into distinct civilizations, not merely in terms of politics and governance, but in terms of fundamental world-view and spiritual orientation. A child born in the North would grow up surrounded by reverence for the old gods and an understanding that the world possessed layers of meaning and mystery that could not be fully explained through rational thought alone. A child born in the South would be raised on the teachings of the faith and would learn to understand the world through the framework of 7 divine aspects and a clear moral code. These differences would eventually shape how the various peoples of Westeros responded to great crises and ultimate challenges, determining which regions and peoples would prove capable of standing against existential threats and which would be found wanting when tested in the crucible of necessity. Far to the east, beyond the craggy cliffs and restless waters of the narrow sea, the land of Valyria once blazed with the fires of dragons and ambition. It was a place spoken of in Westeros with tones colored by awe and superstition, a peninsula of towering black mountains, their molten veins flowing like the lifeblood of the world, where men were rumored to have wrought miracles and horrors in equal measure. Valyria was not a land that merely existed in the minds of those who lived elsewhere. It loomed, casting a shadow across the imaginations of all who dreamed of power and all who feared the omnipotent. But as mighty as it was, even Valyria could not escape the reach of fate. For centuries, the Valyrians ruled an empire forged in fire, their mastery of dragons making them nearly invincible in war, and their sorceries shaping every facet of their civilization. Dragons soared through smoky skies, their shadows racing over tiled roads and towers crowned with obsidian, and the great dragon lords commanded realms that stretched across continents. In this world of volcanoes and ambition, where blood and fire shaped the destiny of men and kingdoms, the Targaryen family was but one among many, an ancient house known more for the power of their dreams than for their place at the center of the Valyrian order. It was this penchant for prophetic vision that would set the Targaryens apart, for Daenerys, later called the Dreamer, was haunted by visions of the future, visions filled with ash, flame, and the ruin of all that the Valyrians had built. She saw the towers of Valyria splintered and gutted by hellish fire, rivers running red, and the sky thick with darkness, the screams of countless thousands echoing down through the centuries. She begged her father, Lord Enar, to heed her dreams, to make ready the ships and the dragons, and all he loved most, and flee to distant Dragonstone, a wind-swept isle forgotten by the grand architects of the Valyrian freehold. Enar, whether from paternal compassion or his own flickering belief in dreams, did what the great lords of Valyria seldom did. He listened, selling his possessions, gathering his kin and enough retainers to staff a stronghold. He made the harrowing journey west across the sea, setting forth not for the promise of new lands, but for shelter against the storm he believed must come. Many mocked him, some pitied him. What use was prophecy, when the strength of dragons burned in their veins, and their empire had endured for centuries unchallenged? Yet Daenerys' dream was not a mere vision, but an augury that twisted through the roots of destiny itself. For 12 years, the Targaryens watched from their cold, unfamiliar perch on Dragonstone, while behind them, Valyria exploded in a cataclysm so complete that it shattered worlds. It was called the Doom, and even centuries later, the word was spoken only in hushed voices. The earth cracked, mountains spewed forth rivers of fire. Sprays of molten stone reached up to consume mansions and roads and palaces. The sky itself reddened with ash and poison, choking all life and blotting out the sun. Cities vanished, and the towers were thrown down. The greatest civilization in memory burned to darkness in a single, thunderous heartbeat. The islands and coasts trembled. The dragon lords perished, their beasts screaming and dropping from the sky. Where there had been power and order, now there was only ruin and roiling sea, the ghosts of Valyria haunting the smoking broken stone. The Targaryens, alone among all the ruling houses, survived. Cut off by distance and by chance, they became an anomaly. The last living dragon lords, keepers of a heritage that seemed as much curse as blessing. Dragonstone itself, perched upon jagged black cliffs and lashed by foaming waves, was a fortress and a prison both, fashioned in the image of Valyria's glory, but set upon the threshold of a new, uncertain world. Its halls echoed with the footsteps and sighs of exiles. Its obsidian walls glittered with the memories of a vanished homeland. It was more than a seat. It was an omen, for beneath its ancient stones, the bedrock was rich with dragon glass, a substance prized as much for the secrets it carried as for its usefulness. Here the Targaryens nurtured the last of the great dragons, massive, scaled creatures whose wings made the very skies tremble, and whose fire could reduce stone to slag. For a century, they watched and waited, a proud family clinging to their identity, their dragons kept close within dark vaults. In the unknown wilds of Westeros, the local lords regarded them with a mixture of unease, curiosity, and respect tinged with dread. Even at this early stage, the Targaryens were set apart, strangers on the edge of old conflicts and deeper magics, their purple eyes and silver hair marking them as other, as a promise or a threat yet to be understood. As time passed, the Targaryens observed the shifting tides of power across the narrow sea. Westeros was a quilt of rival kingdoms, each with their own ambitions, customs, and ancient grievances. Lords warred over crests and borders, forging alliances and breaking them, striving for a kind of unity that always seemed just out of reach. As the Targaryens established their court and customs on Dragonstone, they quietly took stock of the fractious West. Their dragons remained a closely guarded secret, shown only to the most trusted and loyal, creatures of nightmare and legend, possessed only by these odd exiles whose manners betrayed the weight of lost empire. The nature of rule on Dragonstone was itself unique. The Targaryens were a house governed as much by blood and tradition as by the lessons of power. They kept to their ancient customs, remembering and reciting the lineages of their ancestors in the candle-lit halls, gathering around Dragonfire to tell tales of Valyria's splendor and ruin. Siblings often wed, not simply from pride, but to honor the mystical purity that they believed gave them the right to rule and the power to command dragons. Over time, their numbers dwindled, confined by the isolation of their exile and the weight of inheritance. Yet in that crucible of separation and memory, their ambition was not quenched, but honed. The Targaryens remembered the lesson of the doom, that power, for all its burnished magnificence, could vanish in a breath. They remembered Daenerys' dream, a vision that had not only saved their lives, but perhaps the destiny of entire continents. And from that dream, they inherited a burden and a resolve, to be vigilant, to be careful, to be ready should the world once again turn to shadow and fire. Dragonstone became a crucible, forging the descendants of Valyria, not only into exiles, but into survivors and visionaries, capable of waiting beyond the patience of other men. In the cold winds that beat against the black ramparts, and in the firelight that flickered on dragon scales, there was always a sense of preparation, a sense that the story of the Targaryens was not one of mere survival, nor even of faded memory, but of a promise as yet unfulfilled. In the dreams that came to them in restless sleep, some among them saw not just the ruins of Valyria, but kingdoms united beneath three-headed dragons, and the roar of fire echoing from snow to sea. For now, they waited. But as all with the gift of prophecy knew, the time would come when waiting and mourning would become action, and when the fate of Targaryens would become the hinge of Westeros's future. The decision, when it came, arrived not as a sudden impulse, but as the culmination of generations of observation and preparation, a moment when the latent ambitions of House Targaryen finally transformed into concrete action. For nearly 2 centuries, the Targaryens had maintained their isolated seat upon Dragonstone, watching the kingdoms of Westeros engage in their endless cycles of conflict and reconciliation, rise and decline. they had observed how the fractured realms fought amongst themselves, divided by ancient grudges and petty territorial disputes, ruled by lords who squabbled over relatively small prizes, while remaining blind to the greater possibilities that lay beyond their narrow concerns. And they had watched with the keen eye of strategists and conquerors, calculating distances and possibilities, assessing the strength of rivals and the weaknesses that might be exploited. In the year that would come to be marked as 2 years before the conquest began, a man named Aegon emerged as the driving force behind House Targaryen's destiny. Aegon was descended from the ancient Dragon Lord lines, carrying in his veins the blood of the old Valyrian lords, and he possessed a vision as grand and sweeping as anything that had been imagined by his ancestors. He saw before him not merely the opportunity to establish a regional power or to carve out a modest kingdom in the western lands, but the chance to build something unprecedented, to unite the fractured and warring kingdoms of Westeros under a single rule, to create an empire that might endure through the ages. Alongside Aegon stood his 2 sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, both of whom possessed claims to power in their own right, and who shared with their brother a commitment to the grand vision he had articulated. The 3 of them together represented the full flowering of what House Targaryen had become in their time of exile, carriers of Valyrian culture and tradition, possessors of knowledge that had been largely lost to the rest of the world, and most importantly, masters of 3 great dragons. These worms, named Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes, were creatures of tremendous size and power, beasts whose very appearance on the horizon was enough to strike terror into the hearts of men who had never before encountered such beings. In the year 2 before the conquest, Aegon and his sisters made their final preparations. Ships were gathered, provisions were stockpiled, armies were assembled from the loyal followers and mercenaries who had come to serve House Targaryen in anticipation of just such an undertaking. The message was sent out to the various kingdoms of Westeros, a declaration that Aegon Targaryen, the last of the Dragon Lords, was coming to unite the realm under his rule. Some lords received this news with skepticism, viewing it as the boastful ravings of an isolated and presumptuous exile. Others felt a tremor of apprehension, a sense that something momentous was about to unfold, though none could have fully comprehended the implications of what was about to transpire. When Aegon's forces arrived upon the shores of Westeros, they came with the inexorable inevitability of fate itself. The armies moved swiftly, establishing beachheads and beginning their march inland. But it was not the soldiers or the conventional military might that seized the imagination and the terror of the realm. It was the dragons. As Aegon's forces advanced, the 3 great worms flew above them, massive shapes against the sky, their shadows racing across the earth like harbingers of doom. The sight of these creatures, beings that most men had believed existed only in legend and ancient stories, was enough to shatter the resolve of many warriors before they had even engaged in formal combat. The conquest proceeded with terrible swiftness. Kingdom after kingdom fell or bent the knee as the reality of what faced them became apparent. The great fortress of Harrenhal, one of the largest and most impressive castles ever constructed in Westeros, became the symbol of the futility of resistance. King Harren the High, who had ruled from this mighty stronghold, had built it over the course of many years as a testament to his power, and as a physical embodiment of his dominion. The walls rose high, the towers pierced the sky, and the fortifications were considered to be nearly impregnable, capable of withstanding any siege that conventional warfare could mount against it. Yet Harrenhal's mighty walls and towering ramparts proved utterly useless against the dragons. When Aegon and his forces approached the great fortress, they did not settle in for a lengthy siege, did not attempt to breach the walls or scale the battlements. Instead, the dragons were unleashed. Balerion the Black Dread, the largest and oldest of the three worms, descended upon the castle, breathing fire so intense and so consuming that it seemed as though the very heavens themselves had opened up and poured forth the wrath of the gods. Stone that had been thought impervious to harm simply melted under the assault. The great iron gates twisted and warped like parchment. The defenders, trapped within walls that had become their tomb, perished by the thousands, consumed by flames, or suffocated by smoke, or crushed beneath falling stone. King Harren and his entire line was extinguished in that conflagration, their names and their legacies reduced to ash and cinder. In that single action, Aegon demonstrated with brutal clarity what the acquisition of dragons meant for the balance of power in Westeros. No castle, no matter how mighty, could stand against such power. No army, no matter how numerous or how well trained, could defend against an enemy that struck from the sky with weapons that could not be countered or defended against by conventional means. In that moment, the old ways of warfare became obsolete. The age of castles and sieges and pitched battles between armies of roughly equal strength was drawing to a close, replaced by a new reality in which possession of dragons represented an overwhelming and insurmountable advantage. Following the destruction of Harrenhal, the Conquest accelerated. The Field of Fire became another turning point, a place where the combined forces of two great kingdoms attempted to make a stand against Aegon's army. The forces of the Reach and the Westerlands gathered in tremendous numbers, confident that sheer weight of numbers would enable them to overwhelm the invaders. Thousands of warriors assembled, cavalry formations lined up in perfect order. The banners of powerful houses fluttering in the wind, as though bearing witness to the confidence of their bearers that they would emerge victorious. Yet when the dragons arrived above the battlefield, all the numbers and all the training and all the courage proved meaningless. The worms descended, breathing fire, and the field became a charnel house of burned flesh and melted armor. The northern kingdoms presented a different challenge, more difficult to overcome through military force alone because of the vast distances involved and the harsh terrain that made rapid advance challenging. Yet in the end, they too succumbed to the Targaryen tide. When Tommen Stark, the king in the north, received word that Aegon was marching toward his domain, and when he witnessed with his own eyes the power of dragons demonstrated in distant displays, he made a choice that would define his legacy and the legacy of House Stark for generations to come. Rather than resist and risk seeing his entire people consumed by dragonfire, Tommen bent the knee, becoming the first of the great lords to submit to Aegon's rule. He became known thereafter as the King Who Knelt, and though this title carried with it a certain sense of shame and surrender, his decision ultimately saved his house and his people from destruction. In the wake of the Conquest, Aegon established a new capital, building upon an island in Blackwater Bay, a city that would come to be known as King's Landing. From this city, he would rule his new realm, and in the great castle that dominated the city, he established his seat of power. And in that castle, Aegon performed an act of symbolic immense importance. He gathered the swords of his fallen enemies, the great weapons of the defeated lords, and he brought them to the hottest fires available, and there he had them melted down. From this molten metal, forged by the heat of dragon fire itself, he had smiths construct a new throne, a seat of power unlike any that had existed before, a physical embodiment of the union of all the fallen kingdoms beneath a single rule. This became known as the Iron Throne, and it would serve as the symbol of Targaryen dominion for all the centuries that would follow. Yet in all of Aegon's triumph and conquest, there remained one significant anomaly, one failure that would trouble him, and that would echo through the ages to follow. The Kingdom of Dorne, located in the far south and possessed of formidable natural defenses, refused to bend the knee as readily as the other kingdoms. Instead, the Dornish waged a fierce campaign of resistance, using guerrilla tactics and the knowledge of their harsh terrain to harass and harry Aegon's forces. In the course of these conflicts, one of Aegon's sisters, the Princess Rhaenys, was killed when her dragon Meraxes was brought down by Dornish forces. This loss, the first serious setback that Aegon had experienced, demonstrated that even dragons were not completely invulnerable, that determined and clever foes might find ways to counter them. Eventually, recognizing that the conquest of Dorne would be more costly and more difficult than he had anticipated, Aegon agreed to negotiate. The Prince of Dorne sent his sister to treat with Aegon, bringing with her a letter that was said to contain such terrible contents that when Aegon read it, his hand bled from gripping the parchment so tightly. What the letter contained remains one of the greatest mysteries of history, a secret that died with Aegon, who burned the document and never spoke of its contents to anyone. But following his reading of the letter, Aegon agreed to allow Dorne to remain independent, to stand outside the structure of the seven kingdoms that he had created. Dorne alone among all the realms of Westeros would maintain its autonomy, a unique status that would persist for many generations to come. In the centuries that followed Aegon's conquest and the establishment of the Targaryen dynasty upon the Iron Throne, the realm of Westeros entered into an era of unprecedented stability and relative peace, an age that would come to be remembered as the Dragon Age, a time when the very presence of the great worms seemed to guarantee the continuity of Targaryen rule and the subordination of all other powers to the will of the Dragon Throne. During these long generations, the sight of dragons circling above the great cities and strongholds of Westeros became almost commonplace, a natural and expected feature of the landscape of power and politics. The dragons were far more than mere military assets or tools of warfare, though they certainly served these functions with devastating effectiveness. They were symbols, living embodiments of Targaryen supremacy, reminders to every lord and lady in the realm that resistance to Targaryen rule was not merely foolish, but effectively impossible so long as the dragons remained. The Targaryen kings, who ruled during the early and middle portions of this age, utilized their dragons with varying degrees of wisdom and restraint. Some employed them judiciously, using the mere threat of their power to maintain order and suppress the ambitions of rebellious lords who might otherwise have sought to challenge royal authority. Others seemed almost intoxicated by the power that possession of dragons conferred, wielding them with less discrimination and allowing the psychological weight of that power to dominate their thinking. What is certain is that during the first 2 centuries of Targaryen rule, no serious threat to their dominion emerged from within Westeros itself. The great houses bent to the will of the king, and though they continued to pursue their own interests and rivalries, they did so within the constraints imposed by the knowledge that the dragons belonged to the Targaryens, and to them alone. The great dragon riders of this era became figures of legend and song, their deeds celebrated in stories and poems that were recited in great halls from one end of Westeros to the other. Kings and princes mounted upon their dragons, riding through the skies in displays that were part military demonstration and part theatre, calculated to inspire awe and to reinforce the notion that Targaryen rule was ordained by fate itself. The common people, watching from below as great shadows passed overhead, and listening to the distant sounds of dragon roars that seemed to shake the very heavens, developed an almost religious reverence for the royal family and the creatures that served as their instruments of power and dominion. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly eternal Targaryen supremacy, forces of change and decay were already at work, processes that would gradually undermine the very foundations upon which dragon power rested. The dragons themselves, it became clear over the passage of generations, were not creatures that could simply be maintained indefinitely in their present state, whether because of some inherent limitation in their nature, or because of the loss of certain arcane knowledge that was necessary to properly care for and breed them. The dragons began gradually to decline. The eggs that had once hatched with reliable frequency began to fail to produce live hatchlings. The great worms, as they aged, grew smaller than their predecessors and seemed to possess less vitality and vigor. Some scholars and historians who devoted themselves to the study of these matters proposed various theories to explain the gradual diminishment of the dragons. Some suggested that the magic that bound them to the world was itself weakening, that as the ages passed, and as the world became progressively more mundane and less magical in character, the dragons were unable to sustain themselves in their former glory. Others proposed that without access to the secret knowledge of dragon care and breeding that had been preserved by the ancient Valyrians, the Targaryens were slowly allowing their charges to deteriorate through improper husbandry. Still others hinted at darker explanations, suggesting that perhaps enemies of the crown had deliberately sabotaged the dragon breeding programs, or had worked through sorcery to weaken the creature's vitality and fertility. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable and increasingly apparent as the centuries passed. The dragons grew fewer in number, and those that survived grew smaller and less powerful than those that had come before them. The great dragon Balerion, the Black Dread, who had served Aegon and his successors for nearly 2 centuries, eventually died of old age and infirmity, his massive frame finally succumbing to the weight of years. As each dragon died, there was less certainty that its replacement would be born and survive to maturity. The great dragon breeding programs that had been established became progressively less successful, until eventually eggs ceased to hatch altogether, and the dragons began to disappear entirely from the world they had dominated for so long. By the time that a king named Aegon III came to rule Westeros, often referred to as Aegon the Dragonbane, by those who blamed him for the extinction of the dragons, though the truth of his culpability remains disputed, the age of dragons had effectively come to an end. The last dragon, a relatively small and weak creature compared to the great worms of earlier ages, died sometime during his reign, in the year that came to be marked as 153 years after the Conquest. With its death, an era that had lasted nearly 300 years came to its conclusion. The dragons, which had seemed eternal and unchangeable, which had appeared to guarantee Targaryen dominion forever, were gone, relegated to history and memory, and the realm of legend once more. The impact of this loss upon Targaryen power and the stability of the realm was profound and immediate. Without the threat of dragon fire to hold the realm in check, the great lords began to recalculate their positions and to reassess the balance of power. The Targaryens, though they retained the prestige and authority of centuries of rule and the enormous wealth that had accumulated in their treasury, suddenly found themselves vulnerable in ways that they had not been vulnerable for a very long time. They could no longer rely upon the mere threat of unleashing dragon fire to suppress rebellious factions or to prevent ambitious lords from challenging their authority. The political situation within Westeros became increasingly complex and fraught with tension as the implications of the dragon's extinction began to sink in. The great houses, no longer restrained by the fear of dragons, began once more to pursue their ambitions with greater boldness and determination. Factions developed within the court itself, with different branches of House Targaryen beginning to maneuver against one another for control of the throne and the resources of the crown. The realm entered a period of internal conflict and political maneuvering, a descent from the relative stability of the Dragon Age into a state of brewing civil unrest and factional conflict. For many generations, the possibility that dragons might return came to be a kind of obsession for certain individuals and sects within Westeros. Prophecies were studied and reinterpreted, searching for hints that the dragons might somehow be resurrected, or that new dragons might emerge to restore the balance of power and re-establish Targaryen supremacy. Eggs that had apparently been infertile for centuries were carefully preserved and protected, kept in vaults and carefully guarded against the possibility that one day, under circumstances that remained unclear, they might hatch and bring dragons back into the world once more. These hopes and expectations seemed doomed to remain forever unfulfilled, the desperate dreams of a civilization clinging to the memory of vanished glory. Yet in the strange and mysterious ways that fate often operates, the extinction of the dragons was not destined to be permanent. Centuries after the last dragon had died, after the eggs had been thought lifeless for so long that most people had ceased to believe in the possibility of their resurrection, an event occurred that would shock the world and would restore to the realm one of its greatest powers. A woman of Targaryen descent, born in exile and possessing a will of steel, would do the impossible. She would return the dragons to the world, would hatch eggs that had been thought dead beyond any possibility of resurrection, and in doing so would restore a balance to the realm that had been absent for far too long. But that story belonged to a future age, an age that lay beyond the events that had already transpired, and the kingdoms that had risen and fallen in the centuries that followed the dragon's extinction. For now, in the dark days that followed Aegon the Dragonbane, the realm had to adjust to the reality of a Westeros without dragons, a world in which the great worms had become creatures of memory and legend once more, their time as rulers of the skies and masters of destiny having come to an end. In the vast tapestry of history that stretched across the ages of Westeros, woven through the great events and the deeds of mighty lords and kings, there ran a thread of something far more elusive and mysterious than the simple chronicle of wars and conquests and the rise and fall of dynasties. This was the thread of prophecy, visions of what was yet to come, glimpses into futures that had not yet unfolded, knowledge that seemed to come from sources that lay beyond the ordinary reach of human understanding. These prophecies, carried down through generations in the form of stories and songs, interpreted and reinterpreted by scholars and priests, and those who believed themselves to possess the gift of sight, shaped the thoughts and actions of men and women who attempted to divine their meanings and to align their deeds with what they believed the future held in store. At the heart of many of these prophecies stood a figure known as Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised, a name that carried with it echoes of salvation and redemption, a figure whose coming was supposed to herald the end of darkness and the triumph of light over shadow. The legends spoke of Azor Ahai as a warrior and a hero of such magnificence that he had stood against the White Walkers during the long night, and had driven them back through the sheer force of his will and the power of a weapon that burned with a light that darkness could not withstand. This weapon, known as a Lightbringer, was said to have been forged through means that approached the magical, created not through conventional smithing, but through a sacrifice so profound and so terrible that its exact nature remained shrouded in mystery and ambiguity. The accounts that had survived regarding the creation of Lightbringer spoke of Azor Ahai's desperation as the darkness continued to spread, and as the long night showed no signs of ending, despite all the efforts of those who fought against it. In his despair, and his determination to find a way to turn back the tide of shadow, Azor Ahai was said to have performed an act whose moral implications have been debated and discussed through all the ages that followed. He took a sword, or in some versions of the tale an arrow, and he drove it through the heart of his beloved, a woman named Nissa. The accounts varied in important ways regarding the nature of this act. Some suggested that it was a willing sacrifice, that Nissa understood what was necessary, and consented to her own death so that the weapon could be forged and the darkness could be defeated. Other darker versions of the tale hinted that Azor Ahai acted without the knowledge or consent of his beloved, that he committed what amounted to murder in pursuit of the power that he needed. What was certain was that following this act, whatever its moral character, the weapon that emerged was something extraordinary. Lightbringer burned with a flame that was not natural fire, a magical radiance that seemed to embody light itself, a brilliance that could pierce through shadow and darkness in ways that ordinary illumination could not achieve. In the hands of Azor Ahai, wielding this weapon, the tide of battle began to turn. The White Walkers, which had seemed nearly unstoppable in their initial onslaught, began to fall before the light of Lightbringer. Gradually, driven back season after season, year after year, the creatures of darkness were pushed north and contained, and eventually the long night came to an end. The light returned to the world, the seasons began to function normally once more, and humanity, or at least enough of humanity to rebuild and repopulate the lands, survived the catastrophe. Yet the prophecy that grew up around Azor Ahai and Lightbringer did not end with the defeat of the Long Night. Instead, the prophecy spoke of a cycling of ages, a pattern that would repeat itself through history, a suggestion that the darkness would come again, that in some future age darkness would threaten the world once more, and that at such a time the prince that was promised would be born again, a new Azor Ahai, who would once more wield Lightbringer and would drive back the shadow. This prophecy became embedded in the consciousness of many peoples of Westeros, particularly among the priesthood and scholars who devoted themselves to the study of ancient knowledge. It became a kind of fixed point around which other beliefs and interpretations orbited, a focal point for speculation and debate regarding what the future might hold. In the centuries that followed the extinction of the dragons and the decline of Targaryen power, belief in these prophecies and in the eventual return of the prince that was promised became increasingly widespread. Various factions and religious groups developed interpretations of the prophecies, each believing that they understood the signs and omens that would herald the coming of the prophesied one. Some believed that the prince would be born of Targaryen blood, carrying the blood of dragons in his veins, which would confer upon him certain abilities and powers. Others believed that the prince might come from unexpected sources, that the prophecies should not be interpreted too literally or too narrowly, that the prince that was promised might emerge from any of the peoples or kingdoms of Westeros. One particular priesthood that devoted considerable attention to the interpretation of these prophecies was the faith of R'hllor, the Lord of Light, a religion that had emerged in the eastern lands of Essos, and which had gradually gained adherents in various parts of Westeros. The priests and priestesses of R'hllor, particularly those known as Red Priestesses because of the distinctive red robes that they wore, claimed to possess the ability to perceive prophecy through visions and religious experience. They saw in the flames of sacred fires images of things yet to come, whispers of destiny unfolding. Among the most prominent of these priestesses was a woman named Melisandre, a figure of considerable power and influence, whose interpretations of prophecy, and whose claims to possess extraordinary powers of foresight, came to exercise enormous influence over the events of her time. Melisandre was a woman of mystery and contradiction, possessing an appearance that seemed to resist simple categorization, a presence that spoke of both great age and timeless youth. She claimed to have lived for centuries, to have witnessed the passage of ages and the rise and fall of kingdoms, to possess knowledge that had been accumulated over spans of time that exceeded the normal human lifespan. Whether these claims were literally true, or whether they were instead expressions of metaphorical truths regarding the nature of her connection to the divine, remained a matter of considerable debate among those who encountered her. What was undeniable was that she possessed considerable power of persuasion, and that those who came under her influence seemed to believe absolutely in the truth of her visions and the accuracy of her prophecies. Through her interpretations of the prophecies regarding Azor Age and the prince that was promised, Melisandre came to exercise significant influence over the actions of various powerful figures in Westeros. She identified certain individuals as candidates for the role of the prophesied prince, claiming to see in their deeds and their blood the signs that marked them as potential saviors of the realm. Her interpretations of prophecy, though often cryptic and ambiguous, seemed to drive the decisions and actions of those who believed in her visions, leading them into certain courses of action that they believed would serve the greater purpose of preparing for the darkness that was yet to come. The nature of prophecy itself, however, remained profoundly mysterious and subject to interpretation in ways that made any certain understanding of the future impossible. Even those who believed most firmly in the existence of prophecy acknowledged that the meaning of prophetic utterances was often obscured by layers of metaphor and symbol, that what seemed clear in one interpretation might reveal entirely different meanings when viewed through a different lens. The prophecies regarding Azor Egg and the prince that was promised were no exception to this fundamental ambiguity. Different scholars and different priesthoods interpreted the same prophecies in ways that led to radically different conclusions about what the prophecies meant and who, if anyone, might embody the qualities attributed to the prophesied one. This ambiguity and this multiplicity of interpretations created a situation in which prophecy became a tool that could be wielded by those who possessed the skills and the confidence to do so. Melisandre and other interpreters of prophecy could point to events that had transpired, find in them parallels to the prophecies that had been preserved, and declare that this or that individual was the prince that had been promised. They could use the weight of ancient authority, the reverence with which prophecy was regarded by the common people and by many of the great lords, to exercise influence and to drive events in directions that served their purposes. In this way, prophecy became not merely a statement about what would come to pass, but an active force shaping the present, a tool through which the ambitious could manipulate events and bend others to their will while claiming to serve the purposes of destiny itself. Throughout the long history of Westeros, stretching back through the centuries and reaching into the mists of an age so distant that the exact boundaries between history and mythology had become hopelessly blurred, there emerged certain figures whose deeds and whose stories seemed to encapsulate something essential about the nature of human ambition, love, sacrifice, and the profound ways in which individual lives could become intertwined with the great forces that shaped the destiny of kingdoms and peoples. These tales, preserved in fragments through various sources, retold and reinterpreted by bards and historians and storytellers, seeking to draw lessons from the past, carried within them truths that transcended their particular historical circumstances and spoke to enduring aspects of the human condition itself. One such tale concerned a figure known as Bael the Bard, a man of the free folk who lived in an age when the tensions between the peoples beyond the wall and the northern kingdoms remained high and fraught with the constant possibility of violence and conflict. Bael was a figure of considerable cunning and intelligence, a man who possessed gifts of charm and persuasion that allowed him to move through the world in ways that others could not. He was a raider and a warrior, one who had led attacks against the northern settlements, and had earned a certain fearsome reputation among those who dwelt in the lands south of the Wall. Yet, unlike many of his contemporaries among the free folk, Bael possessed an appreciation for the arts of subtlety and psychology, an understanding that there were ways to achieve one's purposes that did not necessarily require the application of brute force. The tale of Bael centers around his desire to infiltrate Winterfell itself, the great fortress of House Stark, in order to steal something of great value. Yet rather than attempting a direct assault or a conventional raid, Bael devised a plan of remarkable ingenuity. He disguised himself as a simple bard, a traveling musician seeking to entertain the lords and ladies of Winterfell with music and stories. He presented himself at the gates, claiming to possess talents that would bring joy and diversion to the residents of the fortress, and such was his skill at deception that he was welcomed into the great hall and allowed to perform for the assembled company. During his time within Winterfell's walls, Bael engaged in a courtship of such artistry and such compelling charm that he managed to seduce a daughter of House Stark, winning her affections through the power of his words and his music and his presence. The daughter, enchanted by Bael and by the world of possibility that he seemed to represent, chose to flee with him, abandoning her family and her station to pursue a life with the man who had won her heart. Yet this was not a simple tale of romantic elopement. Bael and the Stark daughter lived in the very crypts of Winterfell itself, hidden beneath the fortress in the chambers where the ancient dead were stored, and they lived there undetected for years, producing a son who would eventually emerge from obscurity to claim his place as Lord of Winterfell. Years passed before the truth of what had occurred came to light, and when it did, it set in motion a series of events that would result in tragedy and sorrow. The son that had been born to Bael and the Stark daughter, unaware of his true parentage or the circumstances of his birth, came into conflict with his own father in battle. In the course of this conflict, not knowing whom he fought, the young man struck down Bael, killing him and earning a kind of bitter victory that came at the cost of having committed an act of patricide. When the mother, Bael's beloved, learned the truth of what had transpired, learned that her son had killed his own father without knowing his identity, the weight of this knowledge proved too much for her to bear. Consumed by grief and despair, she took her own life, ending the tangled saga of love and deception that had begun years before with Bael's disguise and his infiltration of Winterfell's halls. Another tale that echoed through the ages was that of Jenny of Old Stones, a woman of common birth whose life became intertwined with prophecy and with the great events that would reshape the political landscape of Westeros. Jenny was born in humble circumstances, the daughter of ordinary folk dwelling in a small settlement, possessing neither the advantages of noble birth nor the wealth that might have opened doors to opportunity and advancement. Yet she possessed a beauty and a charm of her own, qualities that drew the attention of those around her, and that eventually came to the notice of Prince Duncan Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne, and a man of considerable power and promise. Duncan, despite, or perhaps because of the constraints that his position imposed upon him, found himself captivated by Jenny in a way that transcended reason and propriety. He fell in love with her, a love so profound and so consuming that it came to dominate his entire existence. In an act of stunning renunciation that sent shockwaves through the realm and violated every expectation regarding how a prince should conduct himself, Duncan chose to set aside his claim to the throne, to abandon the vast power and prestige that should have been his birthright, in order to marry Jenny. This marriage was regarded as scandalous by the great lords of Westeros, as a betrayal of duty and of the expectations that came with royal blood, as an act of such profound irresponsibility that it altered the course of Targaryen history. Jenny of Old Stones became connected in mysterious ways to prophecy, and to the Ghost of High Heart, a mysterious figure of great age and power, said to dwell in the mountains and to possess the gift of foresight. The exact nature of Jenny's connection to these prophecies and these ancient powers remained obscure, hinted at, but never fully explained in the accounts that survived. What was certain was that Jenny and Duncan's story came to a tragic end at a place called Summer Hall, where both of them perished in circumstances that remained mysterious and contested. The fire that consumed them and the fortress itself was spoken of in whispered terms, and some accounts suggested that there was sorcery involved, that dark forces had played a role in bringing about their deaths. There existed as well a tale of such darkness and such violation of the sacred oaths that bound the Night's Watch that the very telling of it was often avoided or minimized in official histories. This was the tale of the Night's King, a man who served as the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, in an age so distant that the exact dates of his rule remained uncertain and matters of scholarly debate. This man, whose name had been deliberately expunged from the official records as though the realm sought to erase the very memory of his existence, fell under the influence of a mysterious woman whose origins and nature remained unclear. Some accounts suggested that she was a creature of darkness, perhaps even one of the White Walkers themselves, or at least something that approached such beings in its unnaturalness and its alienation from ordinary humanity. Under the influence of this woman, the Night's King underwent a transformation that led him to betray the sacred trust that had been placed in him. He declared himself king and attempted to establish a dynasty, and a dynasty ruling over the Night's Watch itself, treating his brothers as though they were his subjects rather than his equals. He enslaved them, subjecting them to torments and horrors, and he wielded dark sorcery in pursuit of his ambitions. His reign lasted for years, a period of terror and degradation for those who served on the wall, until eventually the king in the north and the leader of the wildlings, a man named Joramun, who came to be known as the Giant Slayer, made common cause against him. They allied together, uniting their forces against this aberration, this violation of all that the Night's Watch was meant to represent. Together, they brought down the Night's King, and his reign of terror came to an end. Yet in the aftermath of his overthrow, the decision was made to erase his name and his memory from the official records of the Watch. His reign was deemed so shameful, so contrary to everything that the Order was meant to represent, that it was decided that it would be better to pretend that such a thing had never occurred, that the historical record would be cleansed of any mention of him. In this way, one of the darkest chapters of the Watch's history was deliberately hidden, preserved only in whispered stories and fragments that survived outside the official archives. a cautionary tale about what could happen if the oaths and duties that bound men together were violated and abandoned in pursuit of personal ambition and dark sorcery.